Welcome to Plots in Politics. My name is Corinne Strait. I am coming to you with a very special episode with three women that I admire and I'm really excited to talk to. I think you are really going to enjoy hearing from them as well. First, I am going to introduce Lauren Roberts. Lauren Roberts worked for quite a long time. Gosh, Lauren, 15 years you've been working in policy and politics. You are originally from Indiana and worked in within the Democratic Party, both in DC and here in the state of Indiana. And she is also a certified trauma support specialist, which is vital to this conversation. And you are going to find out why very, very soon. Next, I am going to introduce Elise Schrock, who also has had a very long career working within policy and politics with the Democratic Party in Indiana. Gosh, almost 20 years, right, Elise? You said you first worked with the Kernan campaign. Oh my goodness. And so now next we have Morgan Mickelson, who also worked within Indiana politics and policy. She is a former staffer within the Hogsett administration in the city of Indianapolis as the director of sustainability. So Lauren, Elise, and Morgan, I want to thank you all so much for being here. We put this conversation together within the last couple of days. There was some urgency after I think all of us, I think I can say safely, were pretty disappointed with the statement that was released by the Indiana Democratic Party after several days of silence, almost really a week and a half of silence. And we kind of galvanized and got a group text together and said, all right, let's talk about this. So before we get to that statement, before we get to the events of the last couple of weeks, I want to back us up just a little bit. And Lauren, I want to start with you. Most people around the state of Indiana became familiar with you and your story in a piece that came out in the Indy Star about this time last year, July of 2024. So please share with us your thought process of reaching out to the Indy Star, talking with that reporter, and really kind of what led you to go to the media with your story.
You know, it's interesting to hear you say that's when most people would have become aware of me, because I'm like, was my show choir career in high school not what I'm known for? Man, like, really.
Don't worry, we'll get those clips circulating again. It's gonna blow up, Lauren. Just you wait.
Listen, because I graduated in 2006, thank God, like social media was just becoming a thing. So I don't think those clips exist.
Oh, anyway. I'll track them down. I got people.
Yeah, so the way that the Indy Star story came about, and there was also one not long after by Mirror Indy, which at the time was a pretty new independent publication. I mean, I'll back up. So I worked for Joe Hogsett's first campaign for mayor. I was hired near the end of 2014. I'd started volunteering over that summer. I had been home from DC, home meaning back in Indiana, from DC for about a year or so. I was really burned out after working on Capitol Hill for Senate Democrats. I had some proximity to the Sandy Hook tragedy, and I just, between my own trauma and that, I was not handling things very well, and I needed to just come home and be with my family and take care of myself. And when I started with the campaign, I had been in like trauma recovery, I guess you could say, with a specific trauma therapist for just a couple of months. And I felt like, okay, I've taken this year where I'm teaching yoga and working retail and just living my life in Indy, making it my home as an adult, not a teenager anymore. And I felt ready to dive back into politics. So when this campaign was starting to happen, before, and I call him Joe, I know a lot of people would say Mayor Hogsett, but Joe is how I knew him. Before he had announced anything, I just started volunteering. But between the time when I officially became a staffer early that November 2014 to June 2015, when I finally left, because his election would have been November 2015, a lot of just really inappropriate and abusive behavior happened in the workplace and outside of the workplace, but with Thomas Cook, who at the time was the campaign manager. I was deputy campaign manager, and even with Joe to an extent. All of those things are very publicly available, so I won't get into the details right now, but the short version is, after that all happened, when I left the campaign, what ultimately helped me make the decision was I was experiencing suicidal ideation for the first time. Like a lot of people, depression runs in my family. I'd been on meds here and there, from the time I was probably 13 or 14. So depression was pretty normalized in my family and didn't seem like anything that concerning, and it was very treatable, but that was the worst at that point that my mental health had ever gotten. I was very distressed. I had lost a lot of weight. I was really not okay. And so, I left the campaign not in like the most stable place in terms of my health. Got another job, but went about a month without a paycheck and just dove right back into working. That job, for reasons related to my experience on the campaign, didn't work out just a few months later. And so I spent most of 2016 and into 2017 really struggling financially, definitely with my mental health. I had also started another relationship during my time on the campaign, right around the time I started, actually, with someone who ended up being pretty emotionally abusive and eventually sexually assaulted me in 2018. So I had a lot going on. And, around the time of the election in 2016, the presidential election, the Access Hollywood tape dropped. And that just like broke something in my brain. I don't know how else to say it, or maybe fixed something in my brain is another way to look at it, because it felt like all of a sudden I just heard so much of like my own experience in that tape, and the way that the now president, who, by the way, everybody, is an adjudicated rapist. I just think that's really important to keep pointing out. The way that he was speaking to the woman and speaking about her before he was in front of her, and the way Billy Bush just kind of participated. It obviously was disgusting, but because it had so much resonance with my experience, it really was difficult. And so around that time, I started, thinking about, how do I report what happened to me? How do I make sure this doesn't happen to somebody else? I was also doing this with a couple other abusive situations I was into, so disclosing other abusive experiences I had had. And then it was May of 2017 when I finally just sort of had the nerve to email Joe Hogsett, who by that time had been elected mayor and had been in office for a little bit. It became clear that I was not going to get a reply from him. And so I started reaching out to people around him, including Elise, who is still the only person, with one exception of somebody who kind of manipulated me and really wasn't trying to help, was just trying to get information and gossip about me. But Elise is the person who has had my back this whole time, has advocated behind the scenes. And so 2017 into 2018, Elise and I were talking and trying to figure out, how do I even report this? There was never an independent system for that, for campaign workers in particular. There was also a lot of confusion and back and forth about whether I was a state Democratic Party employee or a campaign employee. So I just kept pushing and trying to ask for help. I kept getting shut down by lawyers for different organizations. Meaning like the IDP or state party and the campaign itself. In 2019, by then I had moved home from New York City, where I had moved to with my partner at the time. After we broke up, I was back in Indy, and I was working on my laptop at City Market and ran into Joe Hogsett in person and approached him, and had the presence of mind, thank goodness, to turn on my voice memo. People can hear that in the Mirror article. That did not go anywhere. He just tried to shut it down. He looked like a scared little boy, frankly. And then things went dormant a little bit for a few years. So, the pandemic happened. I had posted on social media throughout this time, mainly because I wanted to keep other women especially safe. I moved to Denver in 2020. I met my now ex-husband. It was a pretty brief marriage, but I was working on campaigns here and really busy. And then near the end of 2023, I believe, I got an email from another survivor who had a similar experience with Thomas Cook. And I'm purposely not using her name, but people who read these stories will know who I'm talking about. So she and I don't think we connected until either later in the year or early in 2024. We finally, got on the phone, or I was finally able to do that. I had a lot going on between my divorce and some health stuff. And she basically shared with me that she was going to go to the press, that she had had a similar experience to me and trying to report it, that essentially the mayor wasn't taking it as seriously as he needed to. There was still not this reporting process. The trainings were lacking. All the same issues that I had tried to point out along the way, especially on the campaign side. For her, it was on the government side, on the city side. And so, it took me a few conversations with people with legal expertise, just to make sure I understood what the risks were of using my name on the record and all of that. And yeah, we ended up working with a few different journalists at the Star and at Mirror Indie, two very important, I think, like investigative pieces done in very different ways. So they really complement each other. And that was last summer, which it blows my mind that it's been a year, and I feel like so much has happened. Yeah, so that's the long version.
Yeah, no, that kind of gives us a really good chronology here. And Elise, I want to turn to you. And and if you don't, of course, you're not going to remember it word for word, that's fine. But that first message that you received from Lauren, how did that strike you, and kind of what did you do from there?
Well, I mean, I think, and I've since looked back at that message, and I think I said, I'm so sorry, and wish I was more surprised, I think is what I said. Because, this isn't unfortunately a one-off incident. It's a culture. Mm-hmm. And it's a culture that, I had to be brought up in, was complicit in, and then had to unlearn as I matured in my own career. And I think that is largely what we are seeing folks in the party grapple with, and why we are not seeing a high level of emotional intelligence come into play. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately with this, because folks are thinking about their own long-term careers, a culture that has existed for a very long time, ways that they could have and probably should have done better. And rather than, when you know better, doing better and creating a better environment moving forward, we've essentially been met with as an opposition force this entire time. And I think that is what has been the most emotionally damaging part of this for me, is to come up in this career with so many people, and to have my motives for helping someone who reached out and asked for help in a career where that is why most of us get into this career, and people not in this field not understand that that's the reason why I'm pursuing this. So yes, Lauren reached out in 2017, and it's really cringy for me to go back and look at some of those emails where I did try to go back and reach out to the party, because it's been a lot of learning and, again, unlearning about how survivor decentered and uninformed these spaces are. Because I'm not a survivor or trauma trained person. I only knew what I knew at the time. So I was offering to do what I knew, which was policy research. So I'm like, okay, I'm offering to the party this person with no experience in HR to look at other states to see what they're doing, which is, shocker, nothing. There's not a lot out there to protect people from this in political or legislative spaces, which since has changed because we have, learned and come into collaboration with the National Women's Defense League, which has been a huge resource for us. But they didn't really exist at that point. So, I'm looking back at these emails from that time, and I am offering more free labor as an unexperienced person with no expertise. And then I have the party telling me, well, where are you on this research? Like, those were some of the emails I got. And
Mm.
it's like, that tells me enough about where their priorities were
Mhm.
on trying to actually figure this out and fix it. And at the same time, I was trying to advocate for many of the survivors of the Curtis Hill
Yeah.
case. And those same people were trying to go full bore against Curtis Hill.
Mhm.
So there's a real dissonance.
Yes.
And that is, I guess I'm trying to just speak to the fabric of this culture
Mhm.
that we're trying to exist in, and the emotional intelligence that we are trying to navigate, and it is difficult.
Yeah. Because you mentioned Curtis Hill, and I do just want to be super clear. Like, Curtis Hill is a Republican, Joe Hogsett is a Democrat, and none of this has anything to do with politics or party or partisanship. This is always about an abuse of power and being able to exist within this system and exercise that power. And the National Women's Defense League does extraordinary research on this topic. And when you go to their, I encourage everybody to go to their website and also go look at their report that they specifically did on this culture of sexual abuse and harassment in state legislatures. It's a fascinating read, and it's 49% Democrats, 51% Republicans are the identified perpetrators. So this is a pretty even split. This is not about party. And to watch some of the very forceful language come out, specifically around, I remember former Speaker in Indiana, Brian Bosma, Curtis Hill, even our current president, as you mentioned, Lauren, who is a rapist. To hear the forceful language from the Democrats, I'm always like, we're sitting in a glass house. Like, we're throwing rocks and the glass house is crumbling around us. Like, because we are making this a partisan issue when it is not.
And this is something Elise was always highlighting back then, is meanwhile, while they're having these exchanges with her and essentially asking for all this free labor, but not using the work product and not really changing anything and continuing to treat me like I'm the problem instead of the abusers, they're fundraising off of what happened with Curtis Hill. They're fundraising off of the Me Too movement. And I also think I have no problem naming like who was at the party at the time. It was Chairman John Zodi back then, who I first reached out to. Brittany, I think her new name is Doyle, was the executive director at the time, who blew me off and eventually, put me onto their lawyer and just said, any further questions, talk to this person. Karen Horseman was the attorney who eventually had a few exchanges with me. And, meanwhile, there's also is it Nizgaski? Am I saying his name correctly?
Nizgaski. Mm-hmm.
Yep. That there was some reporting in the Star about some pretty scary stuff he was, I'll just say allegedly, so I don't get sued, but allegedly doing, although I believe survivors. And so it's like, when it's not the Democratic Party, Democrats in power seem to have no problem calling it out and fundraising off of it. But the way this party has treated its own survivors is pretty disgusting.
Agreed. And Morgan, I bumped on what Elise said, because I think I was in the same boat when I started reading about this, of being kind of one of my taglines when I talk about Indiana politics is usually like, I am disappointed but not surprised. Like, that's usually how every vote goes. I'm like, yeah, well, disappointment. So Elise said, she was not surprised when she heard this story from Lauren. When you read this, Morgan, in the press about a year ago, were you surprised?
A little shocked, yeah. I have only lived in Indiana for 5 years now. And so I did not grow up in this with these same party members and representatives. So a little shocked in, learning who a lot of these names are, or, I might have interacted with some. I can remember sitting in my office that morning, reading it, and actually preparing to go to a meeting with a lot of senior level cabinet members, and just thinking to myself, they're not going to talk about this, are they? No one's even going to acknowledge it. Now, I will give them the tiniest kernel of credit. They acknowledged it. Because
how was it acknowledged?
It was an interesting meeting. there were crying. There was a lot of crying happening. I would say for both the women they knew as colleagues, but also, a lot of people expressed they thought they knew Thomas Cook and shocked by this behavior. But it was really how they handled it moving forward that I was more so not shocked by, because it's exactly how they have operated in the past in the 4 years that I was working for the administration. Just sweeping this under the rug type of behavior, not talking to staff internally to acknowledge their feelings. Beyond this one meeting, they never did this. The mayor actually never spoke to his staff. I've heard that on the 25th floor, he never had meetings with his own office or attended a staff meeting about it. And so unfortunately, I think I was shocked at the larger picture, but how they handled it moving forward was definitely not shocked by. And that's what kind of helped me slowly wake up. At least that resonated with me, how you were saying unlearning this behavior. Over the 4 years that I was working for the Hogsett administration, I learned quickly, and this was my first time in a local government in a political space, but learned very quickly that you shut up, get in line type of thing. And, the mayor or the chief of staff's word is final. There's not discussions. We are not advising them on anything, as you kind of see in, the West Wing or whatever else.
No, it's working in the government. It's made very clear this is not a democracy.
Exactly.
I'm like, what is it? I thought it was. Oh, no. Okay. Sorry.
Is that the definition? Yeah. And so when I voiced some concerns about how they were handling the aftermath of the story coming out, and not, kind of acknowledging that this happened in this administration and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's when I was met with a lot of pushback.
Oh my gosh. Well, Morgan, since you've only been in Indiana for 5 years, welcome to our nightmare. You're ours now, and we're really glad that you're here. Is your role in the Hogsett's administration, Director of Sustainability, of the Office of Sustainability, were you a manager? Did you have direct reports?
Exactly, yes.
As a manager, did you, even prior to knowing, to reading this story, did you receive training on how you would handle a complaint like this if a staffer came to you?
Wow, you're setting me up perfectly for what happened. So I voiced that concern. We did receive an hour-long animated training that we did. It was required.
Animated.
Oh yes.
Oh, fun.
And people would always blow it off. Like, it was a very forgettable training, and then also it was just kind of a chore that you had to do, right? Mind you, only people that managed people had to do that training. If you did not manage anyone, you did not have to take that training, which also meant you weren't trained on, like, what does harassment look like? What if I'm experiencing something and I'm questioning if that is harassment? You have no resources for that. Along with the employee handbook, which I can't really recite it verbatim, but those were the only two resources as a manager that I had. And I spoke up about that in one of these meetings with senior level staff, and I was met with quite a bit of pushback where a senior director exploded on me, and to the point where I left the room in tears. I was 4 or 5 months pregnant at the time, but still not okay. And it just goes to show you that, like, that's the type of behavior that when they hear something they don't like from the staff below them, they just, mock, demean, shut it down in any way they can. And it's my personal belief that, like, they act that way because those at the top do that to them, and they know they can't push back on that. And so they send it out wherever they can they have to release some way.
And I mean, every time reading through the story and then having this conversation with you, I mean, we have to remind people this was within the last 4 years, y'all. We are not talking about the 1940s or the 1970s. Right. We are talking about within the last 4 years. And what Elise mentioning, the lack of structure or even kind of any lack of official reporting mechanism in place, even for the legislature in Indiana, their official adoption of a process, the version that I found was 2019. So 2019 is when an official "you can't sexually harass people" policy was put into place in the Indiana state legislature. And there are still several states within the US that do not have a formal either ethics process, professional.
And it's not independent. It's not independent. We are not taking the reporting structure outside of the people who have power over workers. And that maintains these cycles of abuse. And it keeps workers oppressed.
Yeah.
Especially women. And that's, we had a huge opportunity in 2019. Folks like, our now chairwoman, Karen Talion, I think sat on one of the committees to help reform that in the State House. And still, it's not good enough. And I think, when the State House did their reform package, their ethics reform, you go back and look at news articles and workplace experts, workplace HR experts, like just tore it apart immediately. Like that those are the articles you see. Mm-hmm. So this is about survivors and whistleblowers, but this is all a workers' rights issue.
Yeah. And how, I don't think it doesn't come as any surprise to me, but something that I hear a lot is, well, why, of course the men are ignoring it. Why are the women ignoring it also? And it is important. You mentioned Karen Talion, longtime Indiana state senator, now the chair of the Indiana Democratic Party. And Lauren, one of your first emails was sent to Brittany, now Doyle, I believe. Brittany, who also a woman. Where is the solidarity with your fellow women in the office to understand, especially when we know the stats of how many people have experienced abuse? We also know from the National Women's Defense League, 96% of the perpetrators are men. So this is largely a women's issue in the workplace. Why are so many women unwilling to acknowledge the problem and be a part of the solution?
In my mind, it comes back to how power works and how systems operate. So, I mean, Elise mentioned, you had to unlearn some stuff after being in that system. Morgan, you also used the term like waking up. I definitely had to sort of deconstruct that for myself because I thought, well, I'm working for Democrats. Like, of course, I naively thought, all I have to do is email Joe Hogsett. He's going to jump on the phone with me and then he's going to fire Thomas Cook. Even just cynically, I thought he doesn't want this heat on him, right? Like of this guy who's clearly a risk to have around. I was so wrong. But before I emailed Joe, I actually reached out to a handful of women, thinking they could advise me. Again, the one other woman who spoke with me, aside from Elise, said she was going to help, didn't really help, ended up relaying our entire conversation that I thought was confidential to, I believe the recent investigation found she related to Joe's special counsel. Lesson learned on my end, but I just thought, oh my God, like women are of course going to be disgusted and help me. And, this was before the Me Too movement went viral, Tarana Burke's Me Too movement. I always say her name because this was earlier in 2017. That didn't go viral till October, I believe. And even after that, you just see particularly white women, I'll say, kind of close rank around the most powerful person. And in this case, that was Joe Hogsett or the structure of the state Democratic Party. I have a feeling there's some internalized like misogyny going on. I've definitely had that experience before. We also just generally have a culture that does not believe survivors, especially women. We have a culture where this is like the one category of crime where we are essentially on trial having to prove that we're good people and that we didn't deserve what happened. And, there's so many directions I can go in and rant about that. But yeah, there's just so many cultural issues tied up with that. I also, a lot of this comes back to who is funding these campaigns. And in a state like Indiana, I don't think this is unique, but the Democratic Party structure largely relies on friendly relationships with corporations and very wealthy donors. In Indianapolis, there's no campaign finance law that limits how much money you can take. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's still the case. It was the case when I worked for Joe. There's a lot of corporate money behind a lot of the people who should be holding him accountable. Not every single Democrat sitting in office, but a lot of them. Jesse Brown, one of the current city county councilors, did some digging into campaign finance reports recently and found that a lot of Joe Hogsett's donors overlap with Mike Braun's donors. And when you look at the policy and the outcomes for a community like Indianapolis, that's a blue dot in the middle of a mostly red state, it's sort of like, oh, obviously, like this is what's happening because of who owns him. Who owns Joe Hogsett is the same group of corporations and wealthy donors who own Republicans. So, I know that can sound a little, those memes of someone with like red string and a whiteboard and like all these newspapers on the wall. But if you follow the money, that explains a lot. And then again, just the way power works and the way that internalized oppression works, I think says a lot about that. And Emma Davidson Tribbs from the National Women's Defense League has echoed that. She said, in their experience, first of all, Democrats close rank around the abuser much faster than Republicans, who tend to sort of find a way to get them out of the way so they stop messing up their strategies, which isn't to give Republicans any credit. They're not actually solving the problem. And also, she said they find a lot of times, especially women in Gen X and older-ish, tend to be pretty hard on the younger women when we come forward. So it's really sad.